Okay, let's begin. Today, we're going to talk about personality. And this is yet another really fascinating topic within psychology. Personality is important because this is where we start to put a lot of the pieces together. This is where we're asking, how do we come to be who we are? How do we get to be the person that we are? What about us stays the same across our lifespans? So there are a couple of different parts to this lecture. And the first two things we're going to talk about are psychodynamic and humanistic. And one of the things I want to point out to you about those guys is that they're going to be very important when it comes to studying different ways of addressing therapy. Because this question of how do we come to be who we are, what influences us, that's key to also understanding how do we help ourselves when we find ourselves in trouble. Okay, let's get going. So, personality is defined as our unique and relatively stable pattern of thoughts, feelings, and actions. So, what about us is the same? We get into different moods, we have different ideas, we dress differently, but our personality is that about us that is the same. As you know, I'm excitable. As you know, I have intense emotions. I've told you all of these things. So people might consider that to be part of my personality. You might be calm and quiet or studious. So let's get into how Freud thought about personality. As you remember, Freud was is considered one of the early pioneers of psychology. He's the guy who looked at human behavior and said, a whole bunch of this behavior is explained by unconscious forces, forces that we don't even know, repressed memories, etc. And so early in the 1900s, he formulated his theory. And it's really, when you think of it, really think of this. It's that our personality is formed from our early childhood experiences, our unconscious or repressed thoughts that we can't access. We can't just think, I'm going to remember what I felt like when I was 3 and my mother left me crying all day. We can't necessarily access that memory, and that there are conflicts between the unconscious forces, which might be my sex drive, it might be my hunger, it might be all sorts of unconscious forces that are part of my biology, and my conscious forces, which are, I know I'm going to get in trouble if I say that, or I know I'm going to get in trouble if I do that. So let's break it down a little bit more. These different forces he describes these are at play in these parts of the psyche. So first there's the id. He calls it the id. That's what you're born with in Freud's idea. You're born screaming, crying. It's your basic drives. You're not conscious of what you are craving and grasping and needing. You just want to feel good and you don't want to feel bad. That's the id. There's not a lot of thought to it. I'm going to jump all the way to the ego, which is on the other side. That is the third personality structure that serves as the center of morality. So, not long into your life, you start to understand what's good and what's bad. You understand the ideal way to behave and the rejected way to behave. You start to form a conscience. The ego is in the middle of these two. The ego is basically balancing the forces. It's the executive, it's the executive function that takes in, what do I think that I want from my id, and how can I best negotiate how to get it, based on the constraints of the superego. And boom, I'm going to now, as my ego, operate on the reality principle. Okay. And here's one metaphor for the ego. The id is often thought of as the part of the iceberg that's below the surface. You can't even see the bottom of the iceberg. You could just never really access it, except maybe a gifted psychodynamic analyst could possibly help you access it. Then the reality principle is the part that is sort of pre-conscious. It's the negotiating part. And then the conscious part is often thought of as the superego that's aware and visible and knowable to yourself. Like you can know yourself and your superego. So here's yet one more way to look at it. So I have this picture of a crying kid for the id saying, I want, I want, I want. And then I have this picture of like a sort of bossy guy. The superego is making you feel guilty. But the ego is balancing what I want to do with what I should do. And that's kind of how you come to know who you are. That's Freud. Now, oh shoot, this slide is not the best slide because some of it's getting cut off. But I want you to know that this is one of the interesting parts about Freud. Now, as you know from our discussion of developmental psychology, the psychosexual stages of phallic and, all that stuff, anal, I don't go for that. I don't buy into that. But these defense mechanisms are kind of brilliantly observed. So Freud came up with these defense mechanisms. I wish I could fix it. I'll read them out to you. Repression, sublimation, denial, rationalization, intellectualization, projection, reaction formation, regression, and displacement. This is so much fun. If we were in a class together, we would totally have fun with this in some sort of a game. But what I'm doing, because we are not in a class together, instead we're online together, I have a really good assignment for you that describes all of these defense mechanisms, and I'm asking you to think about them in detail in terms of times that you've noticed yourself using them and that you've noticed other people using them. And make sure to read the example. They're fascinating. I got to move on because we don't have enough time for all the good stuff. Now, Freud was very influential, and I forgot when he died. It was probably before 1940. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But there were a number of also influential thinkers that we consider to be neo-Freudians. They kind of bought into certain aspects of Freud's ideas, like the importance of the unconscious and the division of the mind into id, ego, superego, and the importance of defense mechanisms in terms of protecting ourselves from threats to who we think we are. But there was a lot of disagreement. They sort of walked away from Freud when it came to biological forces being the only thing that determines what we do, or sexual drives being so important, or the psychosexual stages. So they basically turned the influence away from all of these bodily needs that Freud had into a focus on psychosocial, the social influences, and cultural influences. So here, let's look at a couple of these interesting neo-Freudians. So Adler was a guy who, instead of seeing behavior as motivated by unconscious forces, he placed his emphasis on goals. He said, wait a minute, we're not just running around being driven, with a whip by our unconscious forces. Rather, we are human beings who want things. We have goals in our life. We want to go to college. We want to get a good job. We want to become a lawyer or a doctor or a nurse. We want to start a business. We have goals. And a big part of our goals is to make sure, according to Adler, that we aren't inferior. That if we have goals to make sure that we overcome our basic inferiority complex. So this was something he thought that we had, that if we didn't do things to make ourselves worthy and worthwhile, we would feel like we were less than. So and he says that this isn't it's not like we're born to feel this way, but the circumstances of childhood itself influences this feeling of helplessness and incompetence. Because when you're a child, everybody else is doing this and they're doing that, and you're just a lousy child. You can't do anything. So he says that this sense of inferiority is inevitable for children, and that we have goals to overcome our inferiority, and that structures our personality. Carl Jung, is another neo-Freudian. He believed that human beings had spiritual motives, not just sexual motives and aggressive motives, which is what Freud emphasized. Jung is known for proposing that there's a collective unconscious. So not only do we have an unconscious, but he said that we share an unconscious, that your unconscious has a part with my unconscious. And as evidence of that is sort of the archetypes that you see across cultures. Like, for example, every culture has a hero story, right? And there are the stories that get told in culture after he said that's evidence of the fact that regardless of where we're from or what we do, we share some set of spiritual motives and drives. Horney, let's not giggle at her name, but her name is Karen Horney, and she was a very influential woman who I think had really wonderful ideas and doesn't get enough credit in the world. And so maybe we should take a moment and appreciate her. She basically rejected his bias against women. She said, no, I don't go for that. She believed that personality development depends on social relationships. It's not just whether your mother and father met your psychosexual needs. It's how did they relate to you? She said that basic anxiety results when a child's needs are not met, and that lasting feelings of helplessness and insecurity develop. So this is similar to what Adler said. But she said that coping with basic anxiety involves three basic tendencies. One is to move toward other people. The other is to move away from other people. And then the last one is to move against other people. So she said that people develop these tendencies based on their social relationships in life. So if you have a basically good, nurturing upbringing, you're going to have a tendency to move toward others. So this isn't that different than attachment theory, right? Basically, she says the psychological health requires balance among all these three styles. Sometimes you got to move against, sometimes you got to move toward, and sometimes you got to get the heck away from those people. Okay. There are critiques of psychoanalytic theory. There's not enough support for much of it, empirical support. So we remember at the beginning of the semester, we talked about research methods and trying to find evidence. Well, here for psychoanalytic theory, it's hard to design studies that will actually support the theory. There's an overemphasis on sexuality and biology and unconscious forces, and not enough emphasis on conscious forces. Like you are shaped by what you want in life, and that much of psychoanalytic theories are sexist. So now we're moving on to humanistic theories. Okay, humanistic theories are just a lot nicer because it's not all about sex and aggression. In fact, you could say that humanistic theories were a reaction to such an overemphasis on sex and aggression. Basically, the humanists thought that each person's internal feelings, thoughts, and basic sense of worth were key to who they were, to their personalities. So they believed that human beings were basically good. And in fact, human beings, not only are we born with basic goodness, but we possess an inborn drive to develop our talents and abilities, which we will see gets referred to as self-actualization. Now let's talk about some important names in humanistic theory. So we know, you can see why I kind of like this better already, because I have a fundamental belief that human beings are good. It matches what my sense of the world. Rogers is a really interesting theorist, psychologist. He wasn't so much a researcher. He was largely a clinician. He worked with clients to help them feel better about life. And he had some important thoughts. One important thought was that our mental health is reflected in the degree to which there's an overlap or congruence between our real self, who we are, and our ideal self, who we want to be. Like, if we are who we want to be for the most part, we're doing pretty good. if we want to be someone other than we actually are, it's a cause for suffering. Another is the importance of self-concept, the image of oneself that develops from interactions with significant others and life experience. So it's important not just like how we interact with, our drives and our morality, but who do we think we are? Our self-concept. That's an important aspect of our personality. And who we think we are develops from our life experience. The other thing I love about Rogers is his emphasis on unconditional positive regard. So this is Rogers' term for love and acceptance with no strings attached. So you come to me and I'm going to look at you with positive regard. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to prove it. I'm going to trust that you're fundamentally good. And that he used this therapeutically. And we'll talk more about it later when we talk about therapy. But I wanted to give you a real world example of this. So I had a colleague and his name was Lucas. And he had a philosophy that I thought was terrific. His philosophy as a manager was to assume that people meant well and tried hard. So he called it assume positive intent. So even when people screw up, you grant them the dignity of their own good intentions. They probably meant well. Actually, let's assume that they meant well before I come down on them for being such a stupid idiot and why couldn't you have tried hard? Like, just assume you were probably trying to help, weren't you? And then they give the opportunity to talk about that. And so you assume positive intent unless there is evidence to prove otherwise, right? Because it's not that everyone's always going to have positive intent. It's just you give them the benefit of the doubt. And I thought that this was so wonderful. I put it in my wedding vows. And my wonderful husband agreed to them that when we and we use it, like we're 6 years into this, and when we get into fights, we refer to this all the time. Are you assuming positive intent here? Am I assuming positive intent? And it actually helps dissipate almost any fight when we realize we all have each other's best interest at heart. So another humanist, maybe even more as famous or more famous, is Maslow. We encountered him a little bit already in his hierarchy of needs, but he's sort of he's very influential, and he's known for his belief that human beings have a drive towards self-actualization. And in fact, meeting all of these other needs, physiological needs and safety needs and belonging and esteem, they all help us to meet our drive to be the best that we can be. And so that's interesting, but there are critiques. And some of the powerful critiques of humanistic theory is it's naive. That means it's like a babe in the woods. It's not even looking at, what about genocide, racism, and violence? Oh, human beings are good? How do we do such horrible things to each other? Right? So there's one powerful criticism, I have to admit. And then there's also inadequate evidence. So there's this fundamental idea that we have a drive to be the best that we can be. Really? Has that been tested? Not really effectively. Are we really doing that? Are we really driven towards self-actualization? Can't be sure. So now we're moving right along. That we did psychoanalytic, we did humanistic. Those are important for psychotherapy, we will see. And now we're going to talk about trait theories. This one is less focusing on how did you get to be who you are, and more focusing on what is your personality trait. Who are you across your lifespan? Now, the big name in trait theories is the 5-factor model, or it's referred to as the Big Five. And they came across this, you'll read about how they came across this 5-factor model, but essentially there are these 5 traits that are pretty easy to find. They don't especially overlap one over the other. And usually if somebody's got one of these traits, they kind of have that trait for the rest of their lives. It sort of follows them throughout their lives. So here you have the way you remember them is ocean: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And this chart shows you, what do you like when you're low in openness? It means you're conventional. You're not very curious. If you're high in openness, you're probably really original, creativeness, curious, etc. I'm going to let you read these comparisons because I don't need to read the slide to you. I think you'll have, and you'll read more about it in your chapter. But these 5 traits have been found to be quite stable. And I'm going to give you this link so that you can take your own personality traits according to these big 5 traits. You're going to see if you're high in, maybe you're high in extrovert, low in agreeable, high in neuroticism. Who knows? You'll see. One question is, are these traits really stable? So there's been a lot of research on this. In fact, I went and I found a really extensive meta-analysis about the stability of traits across a lifespan, and the answer is yes and no. Yes. If you're high in curiosity at one stage in your life, you're probably going to be high in curiosity for the rest of your life. And that's true. But are they fixed? The answer is no. There's still movement. There's still some degree of change. So it's not like you're born to be one way and always be that way. You can and people do change. There are critiques of the 5-factor model. One that I find, I think I invented this critique, but it obscures the mental processes that may give rise to behavior. Meaning, it's just saying, oh, you're curious and you're extroverted, but like, what is going on in your mind that's associated with that behavior? It undermines the sense of individual agency in shaping your own way of being. So if you think I was born this way, it may undermine your feeling that you have choices about how you want to be. And that there's a skewed perspective on emotionality, meaning, I'll show you. This neuroticism, it's like temperamental, like if you're highly emotional, it's sort of skewed as a negative. And I have a big problem with that because there are huge positives that can be associated with emotionality, and which we have talked about. And I'm just on the not warpath. I'm trying to advocate for my students to really recognize that emotionality can be a good thing if we learn some degree of regulation of our emotions. Okay. Now let's talk about social cognitive theories. This is good. Social cognitive theories emphasize that it's our social interactions and cognitions in our mental processes that influence who we are. It's our thoughts, feelings, values, expectations. And we've heard about Bandura. Bandura comes to us again and again. He's a very, very good researcher and thinker. And one of his terms is this concept of self-efficacy. So this is Bandura's term for a person's learned expectation of success in any given situation. So if I have a lot of self-efficacy, I have pretty good self-efficacy for teaching. Like I have a long track record of communicating well with people and saying things that, people in a way that people understand. I'm not perfect or any, but I have a high degree of self-efficacy. I wouldn't call that like a big ego. I don't have anxiety about it. I just feel good about it. Like, yeah, throw me in a situation where I have to teach someone something. If I understand it, I'll do a pretty good job. And he also has this idea of reciprocal determinism. This is a really good concept, and it's a good concept to also think about in terms of development. Reciprocal determinism is the belief that our factors, like say my confidence, and the environment, like say, I don't know, Chaffey College, and so my behavior interacts with the environment and it determines itself. So if I do a good job, guess what? My environment's going to change because somebody's going to come and offer me another class. Now I have 2 classes. Now I have 4. Now I have 5. Now I have 6. And suddenly I've determined that I have so many classes that suddenly I start doing a bad job. That's possible. Anyway, but the idea is that a fussy child can actually make an otherwise calm parent an angry parent, right? That's possible. Or a placid child can make an excitable parent treat them in a calm way, right? All of that is possible. So we're constantly working on each other, our traits and our environment. So here's a really interesting experiment about delayed gratification. This is the famous marshmallow experiment. Essentially, they gave 4 years, here's a link, and you can go and you can watch this experiment be played. But essentially, they take the 4-year-old, they put them in a room, and in the middle of the table, there's a marshmallow. And the experimenter says, "Hey, I'll give you another marshmallow if that's still there when I get back." So now he has the option of getting 2. And so the researcher leaves, maybe 15 minutes go by. And the question is, did the child eat the marshmallow? Or did the child wait to get 2 marshmallows? That's like delayed gratification. So those who were good at delaying gratification when they were 4 were also good at similar types of executive function 40 years later. So this is evidence that it's a personality trait. Also, 4-year-olds who were good at delayed gratification were 14, when they were 14, 10 years later, they were rated as more intelligent, more competent, and better able to concentrate than those who did not delay gratification. So there's that. Also, I think when we were talking about stress, we were talking about internal locus of control and external locus of control. And the name associated with that is Rotter. And if you remember, see if you remember which one was associated with lower levels of stress. Right. Internal locus of control. If you believe that what you do matters and what you do can shape your fate, you can actually have it's associated with lower levels of stress and other good things. If you believe that nothing you do matters, it's a huge belief system that really impacts the way you live your life. There are also biological theories associated with personality, and that is that we're born to be the way we are. So in twin studies, basically they study twins who were separated at birth or reared together. And they study identical twins who have the same DNA versus fraternal twins who have like brothers, sibling DNA, regular sibling DNA. And through this, they've identified that 40 to 50% of our personality is due to our genetic factors. So what might that be? Maybe somebody with better balance, who's going to be better at sports, is going to be more confident. Like there may be these factors, and we don't really understand it. I know that emotionality is something that can be genetic. If you're highly reactive and sensitive to noises and sounds, you may be a more emotional person. And otherwise, half of our personality is due to other factors. So half of who we are is what we're born to be, and half of who we are is what environment made us to be. What does this remind you of? The nature-nurture debate, right? And the answer is, it's both. Okay, so I wanted to since we're talking about twins, this is just a fun little, okay. So I wanted to look, because there's really weird twin stories out there if you've never heard of them. So this is the one that I like that I found from The Atlantic magazine. In 1979, Jim Springer and Jim Lewis were separated at birth. They were raised, but they discovered themselves living 40 miles apart, and in Ohio or something. And these are the things that are interesting about what they had in common. So both of the twins got terrible migraines, both bit their nails, both smoked Salem cigarettes, both drove light blue Chevrolets, both did poorly in spelling and math, both had worked at McDonald's, both had been part-time deputy sheriffs, both named their first sons James Allen. Both named them James Allen, with one spelled slightly differently. Both named their dogs Toy. Both married women named Linda. And both got divorced and then married women named Betty. Isn't that freaky? Anyway, too freaky not to tell you about. But it's studying these kinds of similarities and differences that helps us to understand like what is based on genetics and what isn't. And there's still a lot of mystery. So then the last thing we're going to talk about are these different personality assessments. So there are objective personality assessments where you ask people directly about their beliefs and behaviors. So this would be surveys and such. And then there are projective tests, which give you an ambiguous stimuli and then asks you to project a story into it. So I want to show you this picture, and I give you a couple links that you can go and you can look and see more about how they do this test. But essentially in this thematic apperception test, clients are shown like 10 pictures in 50 minutes. And for each picture, the client describes what's happening. Like here we see a woman and another woman. Now, I could start to spin out a story about that. I would start to say how this is this woman's mother. In fact, maybe this isn't even a woman. It's so ambiguous. Now that I look at it, it could be a young man. But I'm thinking, oh, this is a young woman, and the old mother is whispering to her, don't marry that guy. He's not good enough for you. That's what comes to my head. But the idea is that different things come into different people's heads, and then a trained psychologist identifies different themes and comes up with different themes about the person's personality based on the types of stories that they tell about these pictures. And what I thought you might like to know, here are two links. One, all sorts of information about how this test is done. It's kind of like a training guide. And then this other one is the same thing, only all the pictures are in India. It's been translated to India. So you might think that's interesting. So this happens to be my Big Five inventory. I just thought I would share it with you. I guess I'm extroverted, agreeable, and intellectual are my biggies. But you will be taking your Big Five inventory, and this might be my last slide. Nope. There are critiques of personality assessments. One is on objective tests. It's hard to really know because you ask a question about how much do you drink? Well, if I drank two wine, bottles of wine, I might just say, oh, once a week, because I don't want people to think I drink that much. Fortunately, I don't drink that much. And projective tests are critiqued because they're not really that generalizable. So I tell you this story about a picture. I mean, you can't really objectively compare my telling you that story to, you telling the story. Like, it's just hard to sort of find patterns across different people.